as I said to your headmaster, feel privileged to have been asked to come here to tell you my story, and I will do so to the best of my ability, clearly and without any embroidery. You probably all know that there is an annual Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the 27th of January. Quite recently it happened. And each year for Holocaust Memorial Day, a theme is chosen which becomes relevant to the day. This year's theme, you may or may not know, was the phrase, "the power of words." I felt that this was really an inspired choice, because we cannot overestimate the power and influence of words. To give you an insight into that more or less limitless power, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes giving you a brief rerun of history. Well, you probably know that in addition to the war we are talking about, 39-45, which has become known as the Second World War, there was a First World War, which was fought way back in 1914 and ended in 1918. But Germany fought that war also and lost. And in 1918, after the end of the war, the victorious nations assembled a conference at which they decided that Germany has to pay large sums of money in compensation to the victorious nations because they had expended so much of their wealth fighting the Germans during that war. And because Germany had also exhausted itself fighting and now was burdened with these large payments, it resulted in a severe economic crisis in Germany. There was genuine suffering among ordinary people, and many, many people, millions of men, became unemployed and could not earn a living for their families. People, of course, were discontented, and it was in this climate that the Nazi Party was born. It was just a smallish group of people who were like-minded. They were not influential, but they must have known about the power of words, because over the centuries, Jews had been persecuted not infrequently for religious reasons, and as a result, the Jewish people were dispersed into many countries of the world. There were a large number of countries who had small Jewish populations residing in them. As a rule, they were welcomed by the rulers of those countries because, excuse me, it was accepted that having a Jewish minority in a country was good for the economy of the country. They always contributed positively towards the economy. And as a result, they were very welcomed. But, as happens sometimes, the economic cycle changes, and countries where the rulers had welcomed the Jews to reside, when the economic situation changed and people began to be unhappy about the difficulties of finding work or earning a living, these same rulers, in order to protect their situation and shift blame away from them, found that this very small and helpless Jewish population were the perfect scapegoats. And not infrequently, they heaped the blame for what was happening onto the Jews, blaming them for the economic hardships they suffered. And the Jewish people, many times over the centuries, had to pay a very heavy price for innocently being accused and not being able to defend themselves. Well, the Nazis must have read history and knew about the power of these accusations, and they decided that they would employ similar tactics to gain popularity. They launched a vicious, ongoing propaganda campaign against the Jewish people living in Germany, blaming them totally, not only for the economic situation, but saying that the Jews were responsible for causing the war in the first place, all sorts of wild accusations. And they did this on the assumption, in fact, they were probably more or less convinced that any lie, no matter how vile, would eventually be accepted as truth if it was repeated often enough. And this small group of Nazis made sure that it was repeated often enough. They kept plugging away with all sorts of wild and more or less unbelievable accusations against the Jewish people. Again and again, they became sophisticated and directed it at different segments of the population: children, youth, and primarily at the millions of unemployed. And after a while, these lies, as they thought would happen, did begin to bear fruit, to take root in people's minds. It's, I think, part of human nature. If you hear something again and again and again, you begin to believe, well, I've heard it here, I've heard it there must be some truth to it. And people began to believe these accusations against the Jews, which had no founding in truth whatsoever. And after a while, people began to flock to join the Nazi party, and they became gradually a growing and more influential party. It took many years of unrelenting propaganda for them to grow sufficiently to actually seize power in 1933. Once they had taken power, they were now in a position to pass anti-Jewish laws, which they did without any delay. One of the early laws they passed was to deprive all Jews living in Germany of their German nationality. Jews were not worthy of bearing German nationality. Many of these Jewish people in Germany had been resident there for hundreds of years. Some of them had fought in this war and had been decorated for bravery. Regardless of all that, they were deprived of their German nationality. All Jewish civil servants were expelled from the civil service. Jewish doctors were forbidden to treat non-Jewish patients. They passed a law forbidding marriage between a German and a Jew, and so on. There's a long, long list of anti-Jewish legislation being passed over these years. Jews wanted to leave Germany, but it was not the same climate as you have nowadays, where hundreds of thousands of refugees can roam all over the world and find a ready refuge in many countries, admitting them by the tens of thousands. In those days, practically every country had tightly shut borders. Many of them refused to take any immigrants. Some who were a little more merciful had annual quotas, and they would allow X thousand people to enter their country per year. Once the annual quota had been filled, the gates were shut, and there were no more admitted until the following year's quota began. So it was not easy for Jews to leave Germany to travel anywhere else for refuge. But trapped in Germany. Well, in November 1938, there was sort of a nationally organized orgy of anti-Jewish violent activity. More than 1,000 synagogues were vandalized, many of them set on fire. Jewish business premises were broken into and looted, and where it was safe to do so, they were also set on fire. And many thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Well, my parents were born in Poland, but had settled in Germany as single people. They met there and married and settled in Germany, where I was born in 1930 and my younger brother in 1934. Now, in the middle of 1939, when my parents had lived in Germany for more than 20 years, my father was arrested by the Germans, my father only, not the family, and after an unsuccessful attempt to deport him back to Poland, the Poles refused to accept him. He was now faced with an ultimatum. Either he would leave Germany immediately without his family, or he would be arrested. He was arrested, but he would be sent immediately to a concentration camp. We, the family, had been told that if he left, we would receive visas to follow him in a matter of weeks, and we would then be reunited in the UK, where my father had the possibility of going. But faced with the alternative of being sent to a camp, and with my late mother's encouragement, my father, under duress, accepted and left Germany to come to the UK, under the impression that within a matter of a few weeks, we, the family, would follow him and we would be reunited. Unfortunately, 2 weeks after my father left, the Second World War began, and of course it was now an impossibility for us to travel to England, which was now an enemy country as far as Germany was concerned, and we were trapped in Germany. We struggled to survive all the difficulties that Jews in Germany had to face. We were not allowed to enter any non-Jewish premises. If we walked along the street and someone in uniform approached us, we were obliged to step into the gutter to allow them to pass by without coming too close to a Jew, and so on. Jewish shops were closed down. Jewish employees working for non-Jewish firms had to be sacked by law. Jewish judges were expelled from the profession. The list goes on and on. And one of the major punishments imposed on the Jews was that we all had to wear prominently a large yellow star, which identified us as Jews as we walked the streets. This, of course, led to inevitable discrimination against us, sometimes worse, not infrequently beatings, but that was life. We struggled through until December 1941. There was a knock on our door. 2 uniformed men, they were known as brown shirts. When the Nazis gained power, apart from remilitarizing, i.e. building up the German army into a powerful war machine, they formed 2 special divisions who became known as the brown shirts and the black shirts. The brown shirts had certain limited privileges granted to them. One of the conditions of joining either the brown or black were that they had to be Jew haters, but the prime division was the black shirts. They were truly privileged by the Nazis and were treated extraordinarily well despite the difficult economic conditions, and therefore there was no shortage of volunteers to join them. They were the SS. The brown shirts were known as the SA. SA was for Sturmabteilung and SS was Sturmstaffel. It was the black shirts who ran and controlled all the many hundreds of camps which the Germans set up during the war to exterminate the Jewish people. It was all black shirts who ran these camps. Well, two brown shirts knocked on our door, told my mother she had 10 minutes to pack a case, and accompanied them. They advised her to pack some food and water, which she did, and they then walked us, the three of us, my mother plus two little children, to the railway station, where we met a large group of Jews assembled. Eventually, the number swelled to around 1,000. We were all packed into a train. We set off to an unknown destination. When we got there, we found we had been taken to Riga. This map will show you the distance we had been taken. Bottom left, you'll see Kassel, which is the town where we lived. And there's a distance of about 1,000 miles. We had been taken by train. We ended up in Riga, and we were marched into a compound, which was a small area of Riga town, surrounded by barbed wire, which was known as the Riga Ghetto. This Riga Ghetto was formed around 6 months earlier, very shortly after the Germans invaded and conquered Latvia. Within weeks, the Germans had established this ghetto, and they compelled around 30,000 Latvian Jews to move out of their homes and relocate into this Riga Ghetto. This next image will show you that the Riga Ghetto was in fact quite small. You can see there were very few streets in there, and 30,000 people had been crammed into this small area. It was grossly overcrowded. In many cases, several families had to share one room in order to have a roof over their heads. People had to sleep on the floor. But that's how it was. In November of 1941, the Germans, for some reason, had a complete change of mind. They decided to liquidate the Riga Ghetto, and they did it using a subterfuge. They marched groups of the Latvian Jews out of the ghetto, telling them that they were being relocated to another camp. In practice, they were marched into a forest on the outskirts of Riga, where 3 enormous pits had been dug. And as each group approached the pits, there were German machine gun crews ready to mow them down, and they were buried in these pits. There's little doubt that quite a number of them were buried long before they died. They died in these pits. Incidentally, these mass graves are there to this day, except now each one of them has a memorial plaque erected on it, but there are 30,000 bodies still buried there. The ghetto was now empty, and the Germans decided to repopulate it with transports of German Jews, of whom we were one. When we arrived, we were marched into a section of the ghetto, and we were told to move into one of these properties which had been occupied by the Latvian Jews. I remember being really puzzled as we walked into the house. We passed a table on which there were half-eaten plates of soup with spoons still in the plate, and I could not understand what had happened to these people. But we soon found out it was self-evident that the family had been in the middle of a meal when there was a knock on the door, and they were dragged out at a moment's notice told they were being marched to another camp, and in fact they were taken into the forest to be murdered. We now lived in these houses, grossly overcrowded, and the Germans wasted no time in sort of telling us just what all this was about. The next morning, we all had to appear in a major assembly out in the open, and an SS man issued several edicts. One, he told us that anyone who still possessed any money or valuables had to hand it into an office they had opened under pain of death. Two, that from now on, in fact, that particular morning, we would lose our names. Names were no longer being used. Each one of us would be issued with a number. Unlike the Auschwitz camp, where the numbers were tattooed on people's forearms, our numbers were not tattooed. We were each given a number which we had to remember. And for the rest of my stay in the camps, which was around 3.5 years, I was never ever again addressed by my name. From then on, it was just a number. I remember this number, I remember it for the rest of my life. 46578, that was me in the camps. From beginning to end. And it was important to remember that number because we had to appear on this roll call regularly, and each in turn had to call out our numbers. The Germans had an obsession about making the numbers fit. So they actually counted the number who appeared each morning. And if through confusion or forgetfulness one didn't recall or shout out one's number correctly, there was usually a punishment for it, because the SS man in charge usually had an assistant with him who more often than not was armed with a sort of whip. And if you displeased the SS man, you were called aside and you were lashed with a whip as punishment for not remembering your number. Yet another edict that morning was that all of us were being formed into work groups, which would be marched out of the camp each day to work in factories and marched back into the camp each evening under armed guard. Incidentally, all our guards in the Riga Ghetto were Latvian Nazis who the Germans had put in uniform. The officers were German SS, all the rank and file guards were in fact native Latvians. Presumably they'd all proved themselves to be sufficiently Jew-hating to be trusted by the Germans because they were armed. The Germans trusted them with guns. Also, as soon as we arrived, we were put on a starvation diet. And they issued yet another edict that it was absolutely forbidden to barter or bring into the camp any food. As I told you, the vast majority of inmates had to leave the camp each day to work in town, and they were forbidden to accept any gifts of food from the local population to bring back. Many of them had children in the camp. Children under 13 were not obliged to work in Riga. We stayed in the camp. And if people wanted to bring any food back for their children who were also being starved, that was against German rules. To make sure that their rules were obeyed, they punished people who transgressed. I will tell you how in a moment. My little brother and I, of course, were eager to meet up with my mother each day, so we ran to the entrance to the camp each afternoon to await her return, and we usually got there early. On one such occasion, a previous group came back from their day's work, and the Germans, in order to instill sufficient terror into us to obey their rules, would periodically select one or two people for body search to make sure that no food was being smuggled back. On this occasion, a lady who had been selected and was body searched was found to have some food secreted on her. In full view of whoever was there, she was taken aside, lined up against the wall, and shot. And that was my first experience of a violent death at the age of 11. Life went on a daily basis as long as people had the strength to perform a day's work to the German satisfaction and could survive on a starvation diet. One was fairly safe of one's life at that point. Although even then it was not guaranteed. But if one faded and could not perform to their satisfaction, then I'm afraid individually people were just taken aside to be eliminated. And you will see an image here of one such unfortunate person being dragged away to be eliminated, to be murdered. We had been in Riga only for several months. It was early 1942, when one day we were told that no one was going to work that day. We all had to assemble on a major assembly out in the open, and group by group we were led into a large hall, at the end of which sat an SS man at a table on a raised podium such as you see here, and we entered the hall at the far end. We had to form into single file, shuffle down the middle of the hall, slowly until we reached the front of the hall, where each one of us in turn stood before this SS man. He would look each person up and down, and usually without saying a word, would just point left or right. There were two exit doors, and the person had to walk the direction he indicated. It soon became apparent that all the elderly and infirm people were being pointed one way, while all the younger, more able-bodied were pointed the other way. In order to forestall any possible resistance by us inmates, the Germans spread the story that all these elderly people and infirm people were being selected to be sent to another camp where the work would be physically less demanding. And people were sufficiently naive to believe it. The truth soon came about, because within days of this selection, truckloads of clothing began arriving in the Riga Ghetto, and a group of people was formed to sort this clothing. They told us that after sorting it would be sent back to Germany to be distributed to needy Germans. And some of the sorters actually recognized items of clothing which had been worn by their loved ones who had been selected officially to be sent to another camp, but in practice had been taken away to be murdered and had to strip before they were actually killed. And their clothing was now being sent back for transport to Germany. In October 1942, months later, was a day of turmoil in the ghetto. Groups of German soldiers swarmed into the ghetto and behaved violently to whoever was there. It appeared that the Germans had found out that some inmates were planning an uprising similar to the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which you may have heard about, which happened years later. And they obtained this information, apparently, from one of the inmates who appeared to be part of the group planning it, and in fact had been turned into an informer by the Germans. And this may help you to understand the power of hunger. I told you we were being starved, and I meant it literally. this person, who was an inmate, suffering as we were in the camps, turned informer on the promise, believe it or not, his reward for becoming an informer was the promise of some extra food from the Germans. That had such a powerful impact on him that it turned him into an informer against his own people. The Germans arrested all the ringleaders who were shot on the same day, and many others were taken away to be murdered later. But life went on, as I said, as long as one could work. We children were not obliged to work, but my mother did. She worked in a factory manufacturing uniforms for the German army. Other people worked in factories producing bullets and other items which the Germans needed to help them fight the war. In August 1943, some 2,000 of us were told we were being moved to another camp. We were loaded into cattle wagons, and after traveling for a couple of days, we were told to get out, and we were taken into a purpose-built labor camp, which consisted of a large barbed wire enclosure, and the only buildings within were large wooden barracks, which were filled end to end by triple-high bunk beds. And these were now our home. In this camp, everyone, more or less without exception, had to go out to work daily, similarly to the arrangement in Riga. There were 4 children, of whom my brother, who was then aged 9, was the oldest, who were permitted to stay in the camp. They were too young to work. Everyone else, including I, who was then 13 years old, was sent out to work. The majority worked in factories producing goods for the Germans, but both my mother and I were part of a group who were marched out to repair bomb-damaged railway lines. The Allies were concentrating on bombing the German railway system in order to stop supplies reaching the German war front, because all their supplies were transported by rail. So if they could damage the rail system, they would interfere with supplies reaching their soldiers. And we were now being used to dig up the bomb-damaged sections of railway, and we had to relay it with replacement rails to make the lines serviceable again. We had not been in the camp all that long when one day we returned from work and we found that the 4 children who were left behind had disappeared. Eventually we were told by a member of the kitchen staff, who was one of the very few people who were in the camp during the day, that during that day 2 SS men had come in a truck, said they had orders to pick up these children, put them into the back of their truck and drove off with them. And to this day, we have not, despite many attempts to contact search organizations who had access to German war records, we have not managed to find out any information on my brother's fate. We can surmise the Germans did not have any use for non-productive Jews. They were probably murdered either that day or very shortly after they were taken. But we have had no information. We don't know either a place or date of murder. Which was rather like the first, with one major significant difference. The Germans now decided to strip us of any remnant of dignity we might possess. Again, we were taken group by group into a large hall, but this time, as we entered the hall, we were ordered to strip naked, both men and women. And then, naked, we had to form single file, shuffle down as before, stand in front of another dreaded SS officer, who would decide our fate just by the flick of a finger. He would rarely speak to anyone. As we were shuffling forward, the man just behind me in line, a total stranger who I'd never met before and I never saw him again, he leaned forward and whispered to me, "If he asks you your age, say you're 17. I was 14 then. We shuffled forward, and incredibly, that was the very question he asked me. As I said, it was quite rare for him to say anything to anyone, but I was one of the young people, the youngest there, and he asked me my age. And as I'd been primed by this man behind me, I answered 17, and I was pointed in the direction of those who were spared. This man might well have saved my life. I doubt very much that I would have had the ingenuity to say 17, and I don't know whether my answer influenced his decision, but I did survive that selection. And I expect I have reason to be grateful to this unknown person. My mother was not so fortunate. She was pointed in the opposite direction, and naked as we were, each one of us had to follow his direction and leave by the correct door. So there were outside, still naked, two groups of people forming, a larger group of those who had been spared, and a smaller group, again, of elderly or people he didn't like the look of, who had been condemned. By now, people were not naive any longer, and those who had been sent to the wrong side realized their fate, that they would probably not survive that day. And as if by a prearranged signal, suddenly a group of people from the condemned side swarmed across to join the larger group of people who had been spared. There were guards around, but they were taken by surprise, and the first group of people managed to get across and mingled with the survivors. The guards intervened as quickly as they could, and they then began selecting people. I don't know whether at random or whether they recognized, but my mother had been one of those who was rushing across, and she was fortunate in not being detected, and this is how she survived. And we were together again, both of us survived. Soon after this selection, we were again packed into cattle trucks and taken on a journey to another camp. We were never ever told our destination, but when we arrived there, we found that we had been taken to a concentration camp called Stutthof. If you can please have it. This is a photo I should have shown you before. It's a group of Riga Jews being marched out of the camp to work, as you can see. And the next one, please. This is a photograph of us two. On the left am I as a young boy, and that is my little brother, the one who disappeared. He was 9 when he disappeared. On this photo, I think he was 5 years old. It was taken pre-war. And the next one, please. This is the layout of the concentration camp of Stutthof. You can see it was a much more substantial camp. Initially, it had been built as a fairly small concentration camp, but at the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, the Germans enlarged it considerably to its size as you see it here, and also built within the camp a gas chamber and a crematorium. And this was the first time this camp had these two, gas chamber and crematorium. Initially it was built without. Stutthof was, rather like the first camp, primarily a labor camp. Many German large industrial combines had built factories on the outskirts of Stutthof on the promise that they would have an unlimited supply of slave labor, because there were around 50,000 Jews, and also a number of non-Jewish prisoners in Stutthof. The non-Jews were a selection of criminals and political opponents of the Nazi regime, but the vast majority were Jewish people who were marched out to work. The food feeding arrangements, again, were very primitive, and we were being grossly undernourished. And as previously, once you began to lose your strength and could not perform a solid day's work, that was, generally speaking, the end of one's life. We, that is a group of around 300 who had been working on the railway lines, were very fortunate in being told that we were in Stutthof in transit only. We were designated to be sent to another labor camp. And sure enough, after 3 weeks in Stutthof, we were packed into a train and sent on to another camp. The journey was memorable in that we were so packed into these sealed wagons that it was impossible to sit down. In fact, if anyone fainted or died, they would not have been able to fall down, because we were packed like sardines in a tin. And just the pressure of people against everyone would have held them in position. When we arrived, we found we were in another labor camp, which was very close to an extraordinarily busy railway junction, which had a lot of rail traffic coming through it. Trains arriving, trains departing, trains being recoupled, wagons were uncoupled from one train, coupled onto another. There was a hive of activity, and of course it had become a target for Allied bombing. And our group, who had by now acquired a certain degree of skill, having worked on this for a year or so, we were used to dig up the bombed track, relay it. Well, as previously, of course, and it applied to every camp we were in, we were starved. And a rumor went around the camp that some of these wagons destined for the German war front contained food for the troops. And one night, driven by hunger, a group of men managed to break open one of these wagons and stole some food. The Germans, of course, were angered by this, and they raided our camp and in revenge took away 8 men. Some 2 weeks later, we were all assembled in the camp where a large gallows had been built, and we had to watch these 8 men, most if not all of them probably innocent, were hanged one by one. And in fact, guards were made to mingle among us, and if they caught anyone looking away from this gruesome spectacle, they would rifle at us and warn us that unless we kept our eyes on what was going on, we might be the next ones. This is the entrance gate to the camp of Stutthof. It is known as the Death Gate to this day. And I speak from experience. I had never been back to any of the camps I was imprisoned in until last year. I was requested to go back to Stutthof. I will tell you about that visit briefly right at the end of my talk. Can we have the next one, please? Well, this is another view of Stutthof. And on the right here, you will see an image of one of many watchtowers which were built surrounding the camp. In addition to these watchtowers, it had a high voltage electrified fence around the camp. But in addition to that, they had armed guards on each of these watchtowers built at intervals around the camp. Most of us were pretty weak by then, but we still had enough strength to do the Germans' bidding, to work to their satisfaction. After 6 months or so in that labor camp, we were packed into a train and taken back to that same camp again, to Stutthof. By now, it was almost the end of 1944. And when we arrived in Stutthof, we found that the camp was very different from what it had been when we were there the first time in transit. This time we were not in transit, but we were taken back there as inmates. And inmates effectively were condemned to death. That is why it was known as the death camp. Anyone who entered Stutthof was effectively dead on his feet, because very, very few people managed to get out of Stutthof alive. By then, the food arrangements were fairly chaotic. Some days we got food, some days we did not. Many trains arrived bringing Jews from the east to Stutthof, and it became a lottery. Some transports of Jews were taken straight from the trains to the gas chamber, and then their bodies were taken to the crematorium for burning. Other transports were meticulously checked into the camp, all their details were recorded, and they were allowed into the camp. But in practice, by that time, the only difference was that they were, by being admitted, they were condemned to a slow death of starvation, as against the instant one in the gas chamber. The Germans found that the gas chamber they had built was insufficient for their purposes, and they brought in a couple of these cattle wagons, made them airtight and used them as auxiliary gas chambers. They then found they could not cope with the volume of bodies. The crematorium, although working day and night, could not burn the bodies sufficiently, and this incidentally is the uniform we had been given at the second selection when we were asked to strip naked. When finally we were allowed to dress, they did not return our clothing to us, but they handed out this type of sort of convict uniform, which we all had to wear for the rest of our incarceration. The day we were liberated, we were still wearing this. There was no possibility of escape wearing this type of uniform. We were immediately recognizable. This is a photograph of the crematorium ovens. And the next one. Because the crematorium could not cope, they installed additional ovens out in the open. The initial crematorium was a building. You will see a photograph of it later. But these were additional ovens to try and process the number of bodies. But even that was not enough. Eventually, bodies were piled up in the open and were set on fire to be burnt as best they could. You will see here something quite stunning. There was a gallows near the crematorium, where if you infringed or displeased the Germans in any way, sometimes instead of being shot, people were hanged, and their bodies were left hanging for days to act as a deterrent to the rest of us. On the right you will see something remarkable, labeled a soap factory. This man, Rudolf Spanner, was an SS officer, and he persuaded the commandant, Stutthof, to permit him to have a factory in Stutthof at which he used the process he invented of manufacturing soap from human bodies. He would select people who were not too emaciated, who still had a little bit of what he assessed fat in their bodies. He would murder those people, immerse them in some chemicals to try and extract the fat, and then use that to manufacture soap. and he proudly called it pure Jewish soap. And apparently, this is just hearsay, he was full of pride for his invention and would praise himself to anyone who was willing to listen. That was, I think, almost unique to Stutthof. I have not heard of another camp where this took place. On the left you will see the appearance of people who were starved. When I told you that people were starved and lost their strength, well, when you look at that image, you will realize what starvation can do to people. Occasionally, someone in more or less that state decided they could not bear their suffering any longer, and they would decide to end it by electrocuting themselves at the high voltage perimeter fence. But being in the state they were in, that they could only shuffle along very, very slowly, and much more often than not, they were spotted by a guard from one of these watchtowers, and in fact they were shot because we had been forbidden to approach the outer fence, and anyone who was seen heading in that direction was liable to be shot. So their suffering was ended, but not in the way they had intended. Life was pretty gruesome, and we were there from around November 1944 and managed still to be alive in April 45. This image was shot apparently by a Russian soldier when Stutthof eventually was liberated. This camp was not liberated until 2 days after the war ended officially. Germany capitulated on the 8th of May, and Stutthof was not liberated by the Russians until the 10th of May, and this was what they saw. This is an enormous heap of shoes. Before people were taken into the gas chamber, they had to take off their shoes. And this heap of shoes, each pair represents one human being who lost their life by being gassed to death and their bodies burned in the crematorium. This is just a statement confirming that in 1 month, in January 1943, 1/2 weight of hair had been collected in 1 month, because in addition to being stripped of their shoes, any women who had long hair were taken aside and had their heads shaved before they were gassed. And this hair was collected. This letter states that the hair was not only collected, but it was disinfected prior to being sent to Germany to be made into wigs for the German people. And the next one, please. This is a photograph of Himmler, who was Hitler's deputy, visiting Stutthof. He considered it an important, sufficiently important camp to pay a personal visit there in November 1941. I did not get there until 1944. And the next one, please. These were the 2 commandants of the camp of Stutthof. On the left you will see the first one. The camp was opened in September 39. He was in charge until 42. And this one was in charge during the period when we were there. There were many people murdered in Stutthof right from the beginning. But this second one, Paul Werner, he had many, many more murders on his conscience. And you will see the relative justice here. The first one was caught by the Russians. He was tried and executed in 1946. This second one was also arrested, but as you see, while he was waiting for extradition, he managed to escape, and he was not arrested until 1953. By then the climate had changed, and for having tens of thousands of murders on his conscience, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison and was released after 3 years. It shows you the relativity of justice. I told you that last year I returned to this camp of Stutthof. Since I came to England in 1946, I had never been back to any of the camps where I had been imprisoned. I was approached and told that the royal couple, Prince William and his wife Princess Kate, had arranged a visit to Poland and Germany, and they were visiting this concentration camp of Stutthof. And 2 survivors, of whom I was one, you will see me there chatting to Princess Kate, and the person behind, in the middle, wearing glasses, he was also a fellow prisoner there. In fact, we met there, became friends, and we're friends to this day. He also survived, came to this country, and lives in London, and we have been friends for a lifetime now. We met the royal couple, conducted them around the camp, and they asked us questions about our experiences, and they were emotionally quite affected. When Princess Kate saw a photograph of that heap of shoes, she actually burst into tears. And when they entered the crematorium with the ovens still intact, that also was quite a gruesome experience, not only for me, but for them, possibly even more. Because Princess Kate told me that once they had made up their minds to visit the concentration camp, they did quite a bit of reading to sort of gain an insight of what actually transpired, what happened during the Holocaust in the camps. But she told me that despite their preparatory reading, they were not prepared for what they witnessed and what they heard from us. At the end of his visit, Prince William wrote the following into the visitor's book. I don't know whether I can read it from here, but you'll be able to read it. The shattering visit has reminded us of the horrendous murder of 6 million Jews from across the whole of Europe who died in the abominable Holocaust. And he went on, all of us have an overwhelming responsibility to make sure that we learn the lessons and that the horror of what happened is never forgotten and never repeated. And you can see it's signed by both of them. And I have put this on screen in order to impress on you and beg you to take this request to heart. It is all our responsibility to make sure that we learn the lessons, and I would like you to be aware of it and do so. And I would plead with you never to overlook injustice when you come across it. I mean blatant injustice, because one thing leads to another. In Germany also, it started with smallish things and it built up into a Holocaust. And these things should be nipped in the bud. Please do take this message to heart and act on it. Thank you very much for listening so respectfully.